Imagine sitting in a darkened theater in 1990. On the screen, a young woman with a cropped haircut and tear-filled eyes shapes clay with her hands, while the ghostly embrace of Patrick Swayze lingers behind her. That scene from Ghost didn't just become one of the most iconic moments in cinema. It became a cultural memory for many. Demi Moore was more than an actress in that moment. She was love, loss, and resilience personified. But here's the twist. While the world saw a star ascending into immortality, behind the screen was a woman carrying scars so deep they nearly silenced her. The Demi Moore who captivated audiences with raw vulnerability was the same Demi who grew up in chaos, endured betrayals most of us can barely imagine, and fought battles with addiction, heartbreak, and betrayal that no amount of fame or money could shield her from. That's what makes her story so powerful. It's not just the journey of a Hollywood actress. It's a story about survival, reinvention, and the relentless pursuit of self-worth in a world eager to define her by her failures. It's about how one woman, abandoned as a child and broken by betrayal, rose again and again, not because she wanted applause, but because life left her no other choice. Demi's journey forces us to ask questions we often avoid. How do you rebuild when the people who should love you the most betray you? How do you carry on when your greatest dreams collapse into ash? And perhaps most haunting of all, what does it really mean to survive? Not just in Hollywood, but in the most personal corners of our lives. Over the next hour, we're going to walk through Demi Moore's story, step by step. From the shattered pieces of her childhood to her rise as one of the most iconic stars of her generation. From marriages that defined an era, Bruce Willis and Ashton Kutcher, to losses that left her hollow. From the dazzling peaks of fame to the darkest valleys of addiction and despair. And finally, to the woman she is today. Not a flawless star, not a tabloid headline, but a survivor who discovered peace on her own terms. This isn't just about Demi Moore. It's about the truth that no amount of money, applause, or fame can erase pain. But it's also about how scars, when carried with courage, can transform into symbols of strength. Her story mirrors the struggles many of us face in silence, heartbreak, rejection, the desperate search for belonging, and shows us that even from ruin, a person can rise stronger. So before we dive in, consider this. If Demi Moore, after 6 decades of battles, betrayals, and unimaginable loss, can stand today in peace, what does that mean for you and me? What hidden strength might be waiting in our own scars? Before Demi Moore ever became a household name, her life began in shadows that few could have survived. She was born Demetria Jean Gines on November 11, 1962, in Roswell, New Mexico, a town famous for UFO legends. But her childhood mysteries were far more painful than anything whispered in alien lore. From the very beginning, abandonment defined her world. Her biological father walked out before she was born, leaving her with a wound so deep it would echo through nearly every relationship of her adult life. Raised by a young mother who struggled with alcohol, Demi's earliest memories were not of bedtime stories or stability, but of chaos, instability, and fear. The home was rarely safe. Comfort was a foreign language. Instead, she was dragged from one address to the next, moving more than 30 times by the time she was a teenager. Imagine being so uprooted that neighbors never learned your name. Friends never lasted long enough to matter. And every wall you slept beside felt temporary. That was her normal. But instability wasn't the only scar. By the age of 12, Demi had already been forced into adulthood when she discovered her mother attempting suicide. In that instant, she wasn't a child anymore. She was a rescuer. shaking and terrified, trying to pull her mother back from the edge of death. For most kids, that moment would have been unimaginable. For Demi, it was the abrupt and violent end of innocence. She later described it as the night her childhood slammed shut, replaced by the heavy weight of survival, and as if fate hadn't already dealt her enough cruelty. Another betrayal followed only a few years later. At just 15 years old, Demi revealed in her memoir, Inside Out, that her mother allowed a man into her life in exchange for $500, an unspeakable betrayal that left Demi violated and shattered. That dollar amount haunted her for decades. It wasn't just the crime itself, it was the unbearable message behind it, that her dignity, her safety, her very worth as a human being had been reduced to a price tag. It's hard to comprehend what such betrayals do to a young girl's spirit, but psychologists often say that childhood trauma has two choices. It can either crush a soul completely, or it can forge resilience like steel. For Demi, it did both. On the outside, she developed a smile, a mask, a way to appear fine when the world was crumbling around her. On the inside, she carried scars so deep that even decades later, after millions in box office revenue, after magazine covers and fame, those scars still whispered doubts. You are not safe, you are not enough, you are alone. What's remarkable is not just what Demi endured, but how she refused to let those early scars define her entirely. Many would have collapsed under the weight of so much pain before adulthood even began. But she learned a brutal, powerful lesson. No one was coming to save her. If she wanted to survive, she would have to become her own savior. That mindset, born from necessity, not choice, would become both her strength and her curse. It gave her the drive to chase independence, but it also left her with walls so high that love, trust, and belonging would always be fragile. Looking back, it's almost impossible not to see how these early chapters shaped the woman the world would later come to know. The trembling hands in Ghost, the raw vulnerability in Striptease, the ferocity in GI Jane. They weren't just performances. They were echoes of a girl who had once been betrayed, abandoned, and forced to fight for her very survival. And yet, even in the ashes of her childhood, Demi Moore carried a spark. She wasn't content to simply endure. She longed for something more, a life beyond chaos, a chance to rewrite her story. At 16, she would finally take her first steps toward that new life, but the shadows of her youth would follow her, shaping every choice, every heartbreak, and every triumph yet to come. By the time Demi Moore was 16, she had already lived through more chaos than most people endure in a lifetime. School, for her, was not a sanctuary, but a burden. The weight of trauma pressed too heavily on her shoulders to sit in classrooms pretending she was just another teenager. So, she dropped out. It wasn't rebellion, it was survival. She needed independence, and fast. Demi threw herself into whatever jobs would keep her afloat. Debt collection, waitressing, and eventually, modeling. Each paycheck wasn't a step toward freedom. It was a ransom, paid to keep despair from consuming her. Yet independence also came with a hunger for belonging. And in 1979, at only 17, she married rock musician Freddie Moore, adopting his last name, one she still carries decades later. But that marriage wasn't the fairy tale escape she may have imagined. She later admitted that she had never truly felt like a bride. Instead, she felt like a fugitive, marrying not out of passion, but desperation, a way to outrun the ghosts of her past. The marriage lasted 4 years before collapsing, yet even in failure, it became a lesson etched into her life, that changing your surroundings or even your name can't erase the wounds carved deep into your soul. Still, Demi was restless. She longed for something greater than survival. a chance to create meaning out of the wreckage of her youth. That opportunity arrived almost by accident. At 19, she landed her first real acting role on the soap opera, General Hospital, playing investigative reporter Jackie Templeton. It wasn't handed to her, she fought for it, beating out over 1,000 other hopefuls. For $750 an episode, it wasn't glamorous. But for Demi, it was a revelation. For the first time, she was valued not for what she had endured, but for what she could do. From there, Hollywood began to take notice. Yet her inner turmoil was never far behind, struggling with unhealed trauma. Demi leaned on alcohol and drugs as a coping mechanism, using them to mute the relentless noise inside her. By 1985, while filming St. Elmo's Fire, the line between her character's self-destruction and her own reality became dangerously thin. Director Joel Schumacher recognized the cliff she was standing on and gave her a brutal but life-saving ultimatum: get sober or lose the role. That moment became a turning point. For perhaps the first time in her life, someone believed she was worth saving. Joel arranged support to keep her accountable, guiding her through the first fragile steps of sobriety. At just 23, Demi entered rehab and began rebuilding herself from the inside out. The gamble paid off. St. Elmo's Fire didn't just keep her career alive. It launched her into the spotlight as part of the so-called Brat Pack. Alongside rising stars like Rob Lowe, Emilio Estevez, and Judd Nelson, the label was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it branded them as Hollywood's new elite. On the other, it carried a reputation of turbulence and immaturity. For Demi, it was another box the industry tried to confine her to. But she was already learning how to break free from boxes. These early years reveal a pattern that would repeat throughout her life: the struggle between destruction and reinvention. Every time she neared collapse, whether through addiction, heartbreak, or betrayal, there was always a choice to fight back. And Demi chose to fight, not because it was easy, but because survival had been written into her bones since childhood. Looking back, her time on General Hospital and St. Elmo's Fire may not have seemed monumental compared to what would come later, but they were the foundation stones. They proved that a girl from a broken home, with scars the world couldn't see, could stand under the hot lights of Hollywood and not only survive, but shine. What Demi couldn't know then was that the true breakthrough was still on the horizon. And when it came, it would change not only her career, but the very image of love and loss for an entire generation. By 1990, Demi Moore was on the cusp of something extraordinary. She had fought her way out of a turbulent youth, survived addiction, and carved her place among Hollywood's rising generation. Yet nothing could have prepared her, or the world, for the phenomenon that was about to unfold. That year, she starred opposite Patrick Swayze in Ghost, a modestly budgeted romantic thriller that no one expected to dominate the global box office. But dominate it did, grossing over $500 million worldwide and becoming the highest grossing film of the year. And at the center of it all was Demi, embodying Molly Jensen with such raw honesty that audiences felt her grief as their own. The infamous pottery scene became more than cinema. It became a cultural heartbeat, endlessly imitated, parodied, and remembered. But what made Demi's performance unforgettable wasn't the romance or the intimacy. It was the vulnerability. You could see in her trembling hands and tear-filled eyes that she wasn't just playing grief. She was channeling it. Decades later, critics still argue that Demi wasn't simply acting. She was pouring her own scars into the role. Scars carved long before she ever stepped onto a movie set. In one role, she transformed from rising star to international icon. Her short, boyish haircut was copied by women across continents. Her performance solidified her as more than a love interest or a supporting character. She had become a symbol of strength, fragility, and resilience all at once. At the same time, her personal life seemed to mirror the perfection of her professional triumph. Demi had married Bruce Willis in 1987, and by the early 1990s, the two stood as Hollywood royalty. He was fresh off the explosive success of Die Hard, while she had just redefined cinematic romance with Ghost. Together, they seemed untouchable, the golden couple who had it all. Within a few years, they welcomed 3 daughters, Rumor, Scout, and Tallulah, to the world. It was a fairy tale written in flashing lights and red carpets. But behind the photographs and magazine covers, reality was more complicated. Fame had given them everything. Money, admiration, careers that soared. But it demanded a toll neither fully anticipated. Long filming schedules pulled them in opposite directions. Endless travel meant nights apart. Demi, still haunted by the wounds of her childhood, struggled to balance the roles of global superstar, devoted wife, and mother of 3. For Bruce, the burden of being both an action hero on screen and a stabilizing husband at home became impossible to balance. For Demi, the hunger to prove herself in Hollywood, to keep climbing after Ghost, left her stretched thin. Their love was real, but it was battered by forces greater than either of them could control. By the mid-1990s, cracks began to show. Arguments simmered beneath the surface. The distance between them grew wider with every new project, and yet, even in their struggles, they remained committed to raising their daughters and presenting a united front. When they separated in 1998 and finalized their divorce in 2000, it wasn't marked by scandal or rage. It was heartbreak, pure and quiet. The quiet shattering of a dream the world had believed in. Yet even in loss, Demi and Bruce forged something rare: respect. They remained devoted co-parents, standing side by side at graduations, birthdays, and later, even in support of Bruce's battle with illness decades later. Their love story did not end in flames, but was rewritten into a different kind of bond, one rooted in family rather than romance. Looking back, the early 1990s were the pinnacle of Demi's stardom. With Ghost, she had not only secured her place in cinematic history, but also redefined what it meant to be a leading woman in Hollywood. She was no longer just surviving. She was ascending, carrying every scar and wound with her, and turning them into a kind of power the world couldn't ignore. But as the applause grew louder, so did the pressure. And for Demi Moore, the higher she climbed, the steeper the fall waiting just beyond the spotlight. After Ghost, Demi Moore could have chosen the safe route. Romantic dramas, conventional leading lady roles, the kinds of parts that guaranteed box office success without rocking the boat. But Demi was never wired for safe. She wanted to prove that women in Hollywood could be more than background characters in a man's story. And so, in the 1990s, she took risks that would both cement her legacy and nearly break her spirit. In 1992, she stood alongside Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men. Her character, Lieutenant Commander Joanne Galloway, wasn't written as eye candy or a love interest. She was the moral anchor of the story, holding her own in a male-dominated courtroom drama. The film grossed over $240 million worldwide and silenced critics who doubted her range. For the first time, Demi proved she could thrive as the voice of conscience, not just the face of romance, but ambition often comes with backlash. The very next year, she starred in Indecent Proposal, a film with a deceptively simple premise. Would you let your spouse spend one night with someone else for $1 million? The movie raked in nearly $270 million, but the public debate around it nearly drowned Demi. Many blurred the line between her character's moral dilemma and her own life. Feminist critics accused the film of objectifying women, while others attacked Demi personally, as though she herself had auctioned her dignity. For a woman who had spent her youth fighting to reclaim control over her own body and choices, the criticism felt like a cruel twist of fate. Still, Demi pressed forward. In 1996, she starred in Striptease, playing Erin Grant, a mother forced into stripping to fight for custody of her daughter. The performance should have been seen for what it was: a portrayal of a woman navigating desperation, humiliation, and survival. Instead, tabloids tore her apart, mocking her for baring her body rather than celebrating the fact that she had become Hollywood's highest-paid actress, earning an unprecedented $12.5 million. She broke a glass ceiling, but instead of applause, she received ridicule. The shards cut deep. Then came G.I. Jane in 1997, where Demi took her defiance to another level. She shaved her head on camera, endured grueling Navy SEAL-style training, and performed her own stunts. Her portrayal of Jordan O'Neill was fierce and unrelenting, a physical and emotional transformation that demanded respect. And while some praised her courage, others dismissed the film as stunt feminism, reducing her sacrifice to a gimmick. Demi later admitted that the role left her not only bruised physically, but battered spiritually. She had given everything: body, mind, and soul. And still, the applause was fractured. These roles defined Demi Moore as one of the boldest women in Hollywood, but they also revealed the industry's double standard, where male actors were celebrated for physical transformations or daring performances. Demi was often punished. Her risks were labeled reckless, her ambition framed as arrogance. She had shattered barriers, but each step forward left invisible scars. Looking back, the 1990s were a paradox. On one hand, Demi Moore had become one of the most bankable stars in the world. On the other, she was carrying the heavy price of being first, of daring to walk a path Hollywood wasn't ready to accept. And that toll would echo not only in her career, but in her private life, where the battles became even more personal. By the early 2000s, Demi Moore seemed to be entering a quieter chapter. She had weathered the intensity of the 1990s, raised 3 daughters with Bruce Willis, and carried the weight of Hollywood's double standards. Then, at 40, she met someone who made her believe in new beginnings. His name was Ashton Kutcher, 15 years younger, full of energy, humor, and warmth. For Demi, who had spent much of her life in survival mode, Ashton felt like a chance at redemption, as though love had returned to her doorstep with a promise that it wasn't too late. The relationship was instantly magnetic, though also polarizing. Hollywood gossip focused on their age gap, with tabloids branding Demi a cougar. But behind the headlines, their bond felt real. Ashton's playfulness reignited a light inside her that she thought had long gone out. With him, she dared to imagine a future not defined by her past scars. That dream crystallized in 2003 when she discovered she was pregnant. At 41, she believed she was finally being given the family chapter she had longed for. A child born not out of chaos or fear, but from genuine love. For 6 radiant months, Demi carried hope inside her. Ashton kissed her belly, whispered promises, and together they imagined a nursery filled with laughter. But in 2004, tragedy struck. At 6 months pregnant, Demi suffered a miscarriage. The loss hollowed her in ways she struggled to put into words. It wasn't just the death of a baby. It was the death of a dream she had clung to with trembling hands. In her memoir, Inside Out, she confessed that she felt as though a part of her soul had been ripped away. The grief sent her spiraling. Old coping mechanisms returned. Substances, once abandoned, became her refuge again, not for thrill, but for survival, to numb an agony that felt unbearable. Ashton, still young and untested by such devastation, began to drift. Their intimacy faded. The laughter that had once filled their home grew faint, in desperation to hold on. Demi made choices she would later regret. She admitted to suggesting threesomes. Not from desire, but fear. A misguided attempt to keep the bond alive. To prove she was still enough. But instead of saving the marriage, those choices fractured it further. Then came the final blow. In 2011, Demi didn't learn of Ashton's infidelity from his lips. She found out through a cold, impersonal Google alert on her phone. The betrayal was shattering. It wasn't just that he cheated. It was the humiliation, the collapse of trust, the confirmation of her deepest childhood fear, that even when she gave everything, she would never be enough. By 2013, the marriage was over. What began as a promise of healing ended as another wound, deeper than she had ever imagined. And yet, even in the ruins, Demi's story wasn't finished, because from that collapse, she would eventually learn her most important lesson, that her worth could never come from someone else's love, but only from within. When Demi Moore's marriage to Ashton Kutcher collapsed, it wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the unraveling of the fragile hope she had clung to for nearly a decade. The miscarriage had already hollowed her. The infidelity shattered what was left. At 49, she stood at the edge of an abyss, staring into a darkness that felt deeper than anything she had endured before. By 2012, the spiral was undeniable. During a party at her Los Angeles home, Demi suffered a seizure linked to substance use. Paramedics rushed to stabilize her, and the headlines that followed painted a portrait of a star on the brink. For her daughters, friends, and fans, it was shocking, but for Demi, it was simply the rock bottom she had been sliding toward for years. The mask of resilience had finally cracked, yet in that collapse lay the first step toward rebuilding. For the first time in decades, she couldn't hide behind work, fame, or relationships. She was forced to confront herself, the neglected child, the wounded woman, the addict numbing her pain. In therapy, she began unearthing the traumas she had long buried, her father's abandonment, her mother's betrayals, the violations of her youth, the heartbreaks that replayed those wounds. It wasn't a quick fix. Healing rarely is. It was a brutal process of sitting with the very shadows she had run from her entire life. Equally difficult was repairing the most important relationships of all, with her daughters. Addiction and heartbreak had created distance, fraying the bond she had once fought so fiercely to protect. Demi feared she had lost them forever, but through humility, honesty, and time, she began to mend those fragile ties. Slowly, rumor, scout, and Tallulah allowed her back into their lives, choosing forgiveness over resentment. Their love became her anchor, a reminder that no matter how far she had fallen, she was still Mom. Demi's path to rebuilding wasn't about reclaiming Hollywood or chasing applause. It was about survival in its purest form. She turned to practices that grounded her: yoga, meditation, and writing. Her memoir, Inside Out, released in 2019, wasn't just a book. It was an act of reclamation, a way to tell her own story before others wrote it for her. In its pages, she admitted her deepest wounds and mistakes, but also her triumphs. Vulnerability, once her greatest fear, became her strength by her 50s. Demi Moore was no longer the starlet defined by tabloids or box office numbers. She was a survivor who had stared down collapse and chosen to rise again. The scars didn't disappear, but they transformed. They became proof that endurance isn't weakness, but power. Her story reminds us of something essential. falling apart is not the end. Sometimes it's the doorway to rebuilding a stronger, more authentic self. For Demi, the collapse that once threatened to destroy her instead became the fire in which she forged a new life. One built not on perfection, but on truth. When we look back at Demi Moore's life, it's tempting to measure it in box office numbers, magazine covers, and Hollywood milestones. Ghost alone could have cemented her as an icon forever. A Few Good Men, Indecent Proposal, and GI Jane proved her daring. Her marriages to Bruce Willis and Ashton Kutcher guaranteed her a permanent place in pop culture history. But those headlines, glamorous as they appear, are only fragments of the real story. The deeper truth is that Demi Moore's life has been a battle, not against Hollywood, not against critics, but against the invisible scars of betrayal, abandonment, and grief. From being sold out as a child for $500, to the crushing loss of her unborn baby, to the humiliating discovery of infidelity, her life has been marked by trials most of us can scarcely imagine. And yet, what makes her story extraordinary isn't the pain she endured, but the resilience she embodied in its aftermath. At 62, Demi Moore is no longer chasing validation from an industry that once tried to define her worth. She has stepped out of the blinding spotlight of Hollywood and built a sanctuary in Idaho, a space for family, for healing, and for peace. Her days are filled not with the pressure to outdo her past roles, but with the joy of being a mother, a grandmother, and a woman who has learned to live on her own terms. The reconciliation with her daughters stands as perhaps her greatest achievement. Fame can fracture families, and addiction can leave bonds in ruins. But through humility and honesty, she rebuilt trust where it once seemed lost, standing alongside her daughters today, laughing, traveling, and simply living. Demi has found a kind of success that no box office record can measure. Her life also carries lessons for anyone who has faced despair. We often think of survival as a passive thing, simply enduring. But Demi shows us that survival can be an act of defiance, a declaration that even when the world has broken you, you will rise again. Her story is not polished or perfect. It is raw, painful, and often uncomfortable. But that's precisely why it resonates. Because beneath the glamour, she is a reflection of the same human struggles that touch us all. The longing to be loved, the fear of abandonment, the challenge of finding peace in a noisy world. So what do we take away from Demi Moore's journey? That scars do not disqualify us, that brokenness does not make us unworthy, and that even when the world, or the people we trust most, tell us we are not enough, there is a strength within us waiting to rise. Her story challenges us to ask, where in our own lives have we allowed betrayal, failure, or heartbreak to define us? And what would it look like if, like Demi, we chose to carry those wounds not as chains, but as proof of survival? Demi Moore's legacy is more than a filmography. It's a testimony that even after the darkest nights, dawn can come. And perhaps her greatest role is not one played on screen, but the one she lives today, a woman remade from ruin, standing in peace, and reminding us all that resilience is the most powerful performance of all. If her story has moved you, let us know in the comments. Which part of Demi's journey resonates most with your own struggles? And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories of strength, resilience, and the courage to begin again.